and John predicated on
The flounder.
yeah,
Yeah.
without shut down.
Flounder for
And
dinner.
they were at the party. It wasn't like we were on our dole. It's like the
Filleting them as they go.
flounder. No, it
Exactly.
wasn't anything like that. We can probably get started whenever you guys
Are we
are
ready? Okay. Okay. Okay, everybody, let's get started on the Nantucket Conservation Commission special meeting for SBPF for December 3rd, 2018. We are recording, and if you are recording, please let us know. And if you could very good. If you could silence your cell phones, that'd be appreciated. So we'll start with the public meeting, public comment for items not being heard.
I'd like to make an announcement real quick.
Sure.
Please be sure your mic is on and you use it. I have the one between you and Ashley is specifically turned off. And that goes for everybody in the audience. Please use the microphone.
Okay.
I've had to do a few of these from the video and you can't hear people.
Okay, so everybody please use the microphones in the front of the room here. They will not show up on the recording. So.
All right, I have something quick as well. And also as a reminder, if you'd like to make a comment when you come up, please give your name for the record, especially the first time you talk, and use the microphones, and also be sure that the chair recognizes you before you speak so we don't have any crosstalk issues or back and forth, that everything will run through the chair and he'll recognize you for the purpose of speaking.
Thank you. Okay, so now we're starting with the public hearing. Notice of intent, Sconset Beach Preservation Fund, 59-119 Baxter Road. So.
Good afternoon. My name is Dwight Dunk with Epsilon Associates, and we hope to be entering the final stretch here of the hearings. When we were here 2 weeks ago, we had summarized the materials provided to the Commission dated November 16, where basically response to comments on the previous presentations. 2 weeks ago, there was discussion. The materials provided to the Commission on Friday is response to questions and answers, basically putting in writing the topics and issues that were discussed 2 weeks ago verbally to get that into the record, and also just some brief summary of this, project. And most importantly, I'd like to address the attachment 2 of the letter first. And basically I don't know where the feedback's coming from.
None of us do.
No. Move this way. Okay, how's that? What we wanted to do, this is this is table 2 from the attachment that from the letter that we submitted on Friday. And basically what we're trying to show is that the current proposed project, SE 483115, is the extension of the existing project, 2824. That project was originally submitted as a revetment for 4,000 feet through the review SOC appeal process, SOC issuance, order of conditions issuance. What was approved was a 950 foot basic project in the central portion, which had the most erosion observed along this 4,000 foot reach. So what we're trying to do here is show that the existing project and the extension projects, the extension is basically the same that's been reviewed and approved by the Commission and DEP before. The purpose of the existing project is 950 feet to protect pre-78 homes and public infrastructure that's fronted by 5 vacant lots. The extension project is approximately 2,900 linear feet. That's comprised of 21 lots. According to the state definitions, we have 16 pre-78 homes and 5 vacant lots, so those are there to protect public infrastructure. I'll run through the local in a minute. I would just like to finish this table. In terms of the design is essentially the same. It's 4 tiers of geotubes stacked, set back one layer. Each subsequent higher layer is set back. So we have the same design. The only difference is for the extension, it's minus 3 feet million low water instead of 0. Geotube returns. Again, we have the same design, sloped with a shallow angle into the bank. Return extensions, because there is the unprotected bank that is on either side of the existing project, there is some, retreat. And so the roll extensions. Okay. How's that? Is that better?
Is there a, sorry, is this up here, is that the main?
The sound
Yeah, is this
is
No,
the sound is
that's
handled.
lights.
in the booth.
Okay. How's that? I'm not hearing any.
there's a sweet spot in there.
Yeah. So then the return extensions, those have been approved for the existing project. For the extension, consider a special condition that would allow the installation of the Coyer returns to allow for any bank erosion that's along the unprotected bluff on either side of the project. Sand template mitigation, we've been talking about that for the last couple of months, and essentially it's very similar. The core of that is to provide 22 cubic yards at the beginning of the season, have that available for renourishing the littoral drift system with recovering the exposed geotubes during the winter storm season after erosion events. Monitoring. The monitoring is essentially the same. There are some minor changes we'll go through in 1 minute, and then the reporting is the same. Just going through, these are the notes and the written materials. It's all on one page. But in terms of the homes and the protection for the extension project, with the 21 homes, 21 lots, 14 are eligible as pre-78 structures under the local bylaw definition. 2 are potentially non-eligible structures. 5 are again, vacant lots, but they're eligible there to protect the public infrastructure because they're between the top of the bank and the road. And then those 2 lots that support houses that are not eligible are essentially gap lots that you'd have weak points if they weren't protected. They're flanked on either side with eligible lots. In terms of monitoring, the peer reviewer, the town's peer reviewer, has been reviewing the annual reports and the various reporting submitted as part of the reporting process for the existing project. He has reviewed and concurs with these changes to the proposed monitoring program, with the shoreline monitoring being reduced to semi-annual from annual. The underwater video monitoring going from once every 3 years from yearly. And the bathymetry from semi-annual to annual. So those changes have been reviewed, looked at by the peer reviewer, and supported by the peer reviewer. The permit decisions. Therefore, where the project is very similar, the permit decisions, as we've provided with the preliminary draft findings of fact and special conditions 2 weeks ago, show that there's very similarity between these 2 projects. The extension project, as we looked through the existing order, which has about 40 conditions, 6 are deleted because they're not applicable to the extension project. 2 are deleted because they have been completed for the existing project. 10 are modified to be specific to the extension project, and 22 of the 42 remain the same. In terms of questions and answers that we provided the written responses to in writing to the commission on Friday, I won't go into details on those, but basically the themes of all of the questions and answers last week and looking through the meeting minutes for this project, the big issues have been the pre-78 homes and vacant lots or gap lots, which we've just reviewed, the erosion rates or mitigation contribution rates, which we've been talking about quite a bit over and over, and we've provided that response again in writing. The proposed template management, which again we've talked about quite a bit, just reviewed quickly, the highlights of that, and then some of the other issues such as the habitat issues. Those have been the big topics that we've been discussing from different perspectives, being asked questions, nuances, but those are kind of the four big items, and we've addressed those in writing in the packet that was submitted on Friday. In closing, for our presentation for tonight, for mine, that again, as I've mentioned, this is an extension of the existing project that was originally submitted for 4,000 linear feet. That through the process was this 950 feet was approved with the ability to request an extension for the full project. So how do we get there? This project, along the shoreline here has been examined for many years, going back into the 90s. And as we mentioned in one of the earlier presentations with the alternatives analysis. So this is, a rehash of those alternatives, but managed retreat, several of the homes, most of the vacant lots are lots where the houses have been removed off those lots. Some of the homes that are still there have been moved from the bluff westward towards the road. So there has been managed retreat of homes. Beach dewatering, that was tried, that was looked at and installed, had inconsistent results. Beach nourishment was pursued, and that was denied. The marine mattresses and gabions, again, that was pursued about 8 years ago and denied. The coir envelopes have been used in certain lots. Those are generally good for smaller storms. They're more temporary in nature and not robust enough for major or successive storms. And again, after the erosion that was seen in 2012 and 2013, there was a proposal for 4,000 linear feet of revetment, which is the project area that we're talking about now for the existing and extension project. Through the review process, the appeals, the review by DEP, MEPA, that has agency and public review, that led to the geotube system that was approved. Now that geotube system had undergone peer review by Malone McBroom. So this project is the extension of that with, as I mentioned, essentially the same design. And so where the existing project has been there for several years, gives us the opportunities for some lessons learned for kind of a demonstration project. And from that, we've led to the minor changes that have been proposed for the extension, with the slight minor change of the design, changes to the sand template protocol, and some minor changes in the monitoring. So with that, I think we're getting to the point where we've addressed all of the major issues, provided the information and data that the commission has requested, and I'd just like Steve to make a couple of closing statements.
So we've had a lot of information, we've had a lot of discussion, and I think that what you've been presented with is enough information for you to make decisions. And I think what we'd like to do today and potentially next meeting, if we have one, is to just identify any decisions that you feel you need to make in order to make a recommendation for a positive motion, a positive order, and then to what the terms of that order might look like. And I think having that discussion will help flush out, where the commission will end up on this and what any other information you need before we close the public hearing. So I'd hope that we could have a meeting today and potentially a meeting in 2 weeks or so to finalize the whole thing. The only other thing is that we are waiting for Mass Natural Heritage to get back, so we don't getting that letter, so we don't anticipate closing today for that reason at least. Thank you.
Okay. Questions?
Well, I have a couple of comments and questions. First, just a reminder that the commission did not originally approve the revetment project last time. It was denied. And then DEP issued a superseding order, and it went into negotiations before it went to Superior Court with Andy and I and a couple of selectmen representatives. And what we agreed to allow the project after a certain amount of time, sort of with the hope, I guess, that we would see a real 3-day nor'easter that would test the project, which I don't think ever really happened. I mean, we had the one storm with high water, but it was not a very long storm. So I'm not sure that what we had sort of hoped to see out of that settlement ever really happened. So I think it was a bit of a misstatement that the commission approved the project, because originally it was denied and overruled. And then on the alternatives analysis, I'm a little bit surprised they don't have core logs up there, since they want to use these for the returns, which is the area that had the highest erosion rate of anywhere on the whole bank. I mean, it was obvious out there that really eroded, but that's not up there as an alternative. And I think, since they seem to think the core logs are an effective method, I think we could go back and look at, what we had looked at before, of maybe another alternative might be some sort of a hybrid system that incorporates both of these ideas into it.
Let me ask you.
Please, go ahead.
Quick question, Mr. Chairman, through you. When you say the core logs, do you mean at the returns, or do you mean for the whole thing?
Well,
or do you mean a combination system?
Yeah, I mean, and some of this to me goes back to the sand storage, which I'm still not really satisfied with the current proposal of renourishment. And I was kind of thinking that, I mean, I'm not an engineer. I fiddle around with bike mechanics, but that's as far as I go. If anybody's a good car mechanic, I need to talk to you. Anyway, I was thinking maybe if you did, instead of 3 tubes stacked up on the bank, take the top set of big tubes off and put the core logs on the back as sort of the final buffer, and then you could store a lot more sand up on the top and just pile that sand up on the top of this thing quite high. Then in a big storm, I mean, the issue why we wanted to go to 4 layers was because in the big storms it's going to overtop 3. Well, if it does, and you've got all that sand up on top, then it'll take that sand into the system.
Right. That's an interesting idea. I mean, I guess what I would say is, if the commission wants to identify specific areas where we could make adjustments, like on the returns or on the top tube, certainly we could discuss that. I think that the opportunity for improvement is both now and perpetual, but now is better. And I think what we did see through this 5 years of 3 tubes, and then the last 3 of those where there was 4 tubes, was essentially no reportable negative impacts for down beach erosion, and that we had substantial beach nourishment or sand nourishment that beat the natural erosion rate every year, and that's what we're proposing here. So I think when we dealt with this last time, Ernie, you're right that the commission originally denied it, and we got a superseding order from the state, and then there was a approval of a non-emergency order, but of a regular order of conditions by this commission, with the idea that we would come back in 3 years to see whether there had been any problems and whether there was either a need for or an opportunity for an improvement to the design. But at the end of the day, I think what we have is a system that meets all of the legal standards. Okay, we have pre-78 houses, we have an endangerment to those houses and to the public infrastructure. We have a system that is designed to be no more robust than necessary, and a mitigation system that is essentially the most robust in the country. And we're open to making it better in terms of protection. We're open to making it better in terms of sand nourishment. And that's what we'd like to get to, is to identify where in the design you think there might be some room for improvement, or in the mitigation some room for improvement. And we've suggested some, and we'd love to have the conversation about anything else you'd like to discuss. But it should just be tied to, the actual an actual concern, as opposed to just sort of piling on more and more and more. Like going to more sand actually isn't necessarily better. In fact, it's potentially worse if you get to a level where you're just covering the bottom. But if there's ideas that you'd like to discuss, some kind of hybrid system or some kind of alternatives, we could certainly discuss that.
Huh?
Let me try moving this, Josh.
Yeah, actually, that's a good idea. Hi, Jamie Feely for the record. I just wanted to remind you about last March, because I think in that instance there were 3 consecutive nor'easters that went on for several high tides each, and it did kind of present, after 5 years, a couple challenges that we hadn't seen yet to that point, and that's what predicated us buying a designated dozer, just as far as accessibility. And I think it also is got us thinking about the coir logs as a more adaptive way to deal with the ends there when it becomes exposed in the middle of the season. So anyway, I just wanted to point that out. Thanks.
It's just me, I guess. Without rehashing all the details again, but just to summarize quickly what we had talked about last time and throughout this process, that the design in... I don't know if that makes it any better. No? That what was presented 2 weeks ago was that in front of the proposed coir system is over 6 cubic yards per linear foot. So that's that's about 2/3 of the volume of the annual average that's contributed off the bank for this 3,500 linear feet. The idea is, not the idea, but the proposal is to have 22 cubic yards per linear foot stockpile on top of the template to be used to recover, and then to refill that to the 22, so that at the beginning of every storm season, there's 22 cubic yards of sand available per linear foot. And that way we have, 2 to 3 times, depending on the, with the average, of sand available. So therefore, in higher years, there's plenty of sand available like there was last year. In more average years, there's an excess of sand. The standard approach, as we've discussed, that DEP and CZM have approved, is to have a once-a-year placement of sand based on the average retreat of the height in bank retreat. We've gone through all those details. So this adaptive management has plenty of stockpiled material on top of the template, and then the ability to recover those tubes within 10 business days as proposed after each erosion event. So the material is contributed to the system periodically and consistent with the CZM policies and the regulations.
Dwight, if I could ask, if 22 cubic yards per linear foot. Can't hear, sorry. I don't know which one to turn
My bad.
on anymore. I'm not sure to turn this one. Can you hear me now? So if 22 cubic yards per linear foot per year becomes insufficient somewhere in the future, is there flexibility built into your plan?
Yes, as in the written responses that were provided, one of the questions last week was, is there an upper limit? And the answer is no. What it is that the conditions are that the exposed tubes need to be covered after storm events. So if more sand on a particularly heavy year is needed, more sand would need to be imported and placed and covered. It's just that the the idea about the prediction, we can't predict the future, but we use the historic rates to use as a guide going forward. And we've seen that, for the 900 plus feet, the 950 feet, it was 12 cubic yards per linear foot contribution off the bluff. That's an area that had a high erosion rate. And then the average for the extension areas is 7.7 cubic yards. For the whole thing, it's 8.8. So what that means is some years it's high, some years it's low. As we've talked about, it's episodic erosion. That 2012, 2013, where we lost 30 feet of bluff, that's an episodic event. You don't see that all the time, but you also don't see this retreating, whatever the average rate of 2.8 feet per year. You see the toe being lost, the bank steepening, it gets over steepened, and then a large episodic event. So the idea is there isn't the upper limit, but on average, that 22 is going to be there. In most years, less than 22 would be needed, and then it would be refilled up to 22 before the next storm season.
Can I ask a follow-up? That mic's off. So I appreciate that explanation, and I guess I am concerned for the years where maybe it would require more than 22 cubic yards per linear foot, and how you would know that the bluff would have given off more sand in those years. Because, I read climate change reports, and unfortunately, we're probably going to be entering a span of years where we're having larger storms on a more regular basis. So the average since 94 or some of those averages might not account for these years coming up where I think we're going to have larger storms on a more regular basis. And just how will we quantify the gap between the 22 cubic yards per linear foot and a year that it would have been donating more than that?
Well, as I mentioned, we can't predict the future. The CZM policy and the DEP standards of best available measures is to use the long-term average. As we've discussed, the long-term average using the CZM shoreline change project data is less than a foot per year of retreat, which would be much, much less than the 22. The more applicable is to use the site-specific, project-specific period that we've used, which is a short time span relative to the 160-plus year data set that the CZM uses. And it includes that high 2012-2013 year where 30 feet were lost off of this nodal area. So it does include a high this period that we've used, which is consistent with the policy of long-term or short-term if the issuing agency thinks that that's more appropriate or applicable. So we have a shorter term here. It's a decent length of time, and it also includes that year where you had a large erosion event. So it's not that the data was cut off to exclude that year. So as I said, we can't predict the future, but we're using the best available data to provide an adequate amount of sand. And as I mentioned, the existing project area is about 12 cubic yards. The extension area is a little less than 8. So still having 22 is a nice factor of safety at the beginning of each season. And the current conditions in what's proposed in the draft is that any exposed after erosion events, that those exposed tubes gets covered, and if more sand is needed, more sand is brought in.
So essentially, this caps out, besides the refilling the template, as far as like quantifiable data, the 22 yards per cubic foot is where this project kind of caps out at assessing erosion rates. Because if we go
No. And the other thing we do that you're undoubtedly aware of is we have surveys on the unprotected portions of the adjacent unprotected areas. So if we're seeing greater erosion rates there, we can make adjustments to what we put on the template.
Yeah, I think that's an important point. I mean, I don't think we have an accurate control point really, because the bluff that's eroding most is where the structure will be. I think we have maybe something to look at, right? And to make future sort of assessments as to how much we might need in a template. But I can only speak for myself, but I think to the tone of the board that we don't want to be locked into something that's, not going to be enough in the future.
Yeah, and I think that's the beauty of the adaptive system, where we're basically putting out 2.5 or 3 times the amount of sand that we expect would be taken in an average year, with nearly an entire year's worth of sand at the readily available level, and then 2 times that at the readily distributable level, and then having the ability to track that as we go. So if we see that either there's any indication of any negative impact or any indication of a change in the historic rates of unprotected areas, you're going to get an annual report with all of this quarterly data that shows, the numbers have changed. We should be adjusting the system. The system that we're proposing is both adaptive in real time and adaptive from a permitting point of view. And we would be open to and expect a condition that allows you to do that, which is highly unusual for you. Usually you get a guess now and then you're locked in forever. But we would in this case agree to a permit that allowed for those kind of changes.
But what about if that's like 9 months and then we gotta wait, it's 3 months after report and then 9 months later that we get a report that it's been starving the system. I mean, that's where I'm having a problem. It should be that if there's a starvation of the system, then I'd want you guys to come in like our next meeting and say, we need to up the amounts of sand or whatever. I just feel like that could be a problem.
Well, we're required to submit reports after significant storm events, and if we found that there was some kind of 500 or 1,000-year storm that had some impact, the commission could certainly, based on that event, order something to happen. We're not trying to get away with avoiding anything, right? So if we had something like that happen, that where you didn't want to necessarily adjust the permit, but wanted to have a one-time, contribution, that could be built into it. That anything that if there's a massive event that we report on and we have to report, there's criteria in there. You could have a mitigation order issued from that event. So that would give you, the ability to act within weeks or months, or certainly a very short time in the natural cycle.
So I have a couple of observations to make. So Dwight, you said that this was CZM.
I think you're gonna need to bring your microphone a little closer.
Okay. But the CZM calculated rate was...
I don't think it's on.
The light's on.
It is on.
They can't hear you in the audience.
Just pull it in tighter.
Yeah, a little closer.
Can you hear me now?
Nice.
Okay. So you said that the CZM calculation was a retreat rate of 1 foot a year. Did you not? just a few minutes ago?
The CZM shoreline change maps for this area
Yeah.
show that, from their 160-year data set that includes times of erosion and accretion, that average is less than a foot per year.
So I presented to the public a map, a photograph taken in 1975 that I don't know if you've seen it, and I'm happy to show it to you right here because it happens to have what was our family house at 99 Baxter Road. And in 1975, we still had basically everything. And 40 years later, there's hardly anything left of that lot. And so that was a rate over 40 years of between 5 and at least an average of 5 a year. And it may be as high as 8. And we would watch, we would actually lose up to 15 feet in a strong 3-day nor'easter would collapse from the bluff. So I really would dispute that figure as being particularly germane for the project.
Correct, and that's why that figure from the CZM shoreline change project is not being used. The CZM comment letter back, for the existing project identified that the long-term erosion was not applicable for this nodal point. That erosion has increased since the 70s, along this stretch, has increased since the 70s, and therefore a shorter term period, which is we're using a 24-year period for most of this stretch and a 17-year period for the southern end. And, they were saying that that's more applicable. The peer reviewer for the existing project, Malone and McBroom, for the town, identified that, their professional opinion that the specific time period used was appropriate for the existing project, and that what you're observing is consistent with what CZM has been saying, and that's why we're using the shorter term, the more near term period of 24 years or so for calculating that, because we have some more detailed survey data that allows those measurements.
So thank you. I just want it on the record that the 1 foot per year is wildly inaccurate when it comes to what's been taking place.
And Ian, actually, if we look at the nodal point that we have, I think our data showed it was on average of 4.7 feet per year for this period, so
Right.
Which is consistent with what you're saying. So we're not disputing or disagreeing. I think
Okay.
we're at the same point, and that's what leads to the 12 cubic yards per linear foot, and therefore from contribution from the existing bluff over this time period for the 1,000-foot, and then 7.7 for the other 2,900 linear feet. So because those areas have been eroding at slightly lesser rates than this central portion has.
So I have a couple of, go ahead.
I just want to add one point. I know there's a lot of fear that we're not putting enough sand out there and that the project might fail. Let's remember that your previous order of conditions had a failure criteria. And if the beach goes away, the project goes away. So that's something that's a backstop here.
Yes, and I appreciated Jamie making the point that this spring that it was clear that it was the amount of sand that was being released was insufficient. And so I thought that Ernie's idea of removing a tube and having more sand on there would be worth exploring. But Jamie, I don't know if I'm putting words into your mouth there that you'd like to dispute, but we all saw that it looked, even less hair than I have, so to speak, for a week or two.
So I didn't specifically make that point that I thought the sand was insufficient. The point that I was trying to make was that there was that period of time in March where we did see back-to-back, I think 3 good northeasters that lasted a period of time. And I was just bringing that up in response to, to Ernie, who had mentioned, in 5 years that he wasn't sure if we had seen the test that he was hoping to have seen, and I think that's just the closest, certainly a stretch of time to seeing something that did kind of test the ability and that we were able to learn some better ways of maintaining it.
Right. Well, thank you. So,
I just want to, one last, to belabor, but remember from what we presented previously, that for the past several years since the project was constructed, it was an average, those 3 years average was about 13.5 cubic yards per linear foot. Last year was a little over 20. The previous years, which were quieter years, had 8-9 cubic yards contributed off. So the idea that we had a big storm season, Jamie and his crew kept putting the sand out, from the top of the template to cover tubes as quickly as they could, and having that stockpile of sand on top of the template and bringing in sand when needed to make sure that stockpile was there so that they could continue being covered. So the idea is not that there's a upset limit or max of 22. There's 22 available at the beginning of the season. If more is needed to bring that stockpile up, it would be brought in and then covering the tubes.
so I have a couple of other points, a minor one, I suppose, but where it says beach dewatering installed in 2000, it was installed initially long before then. So Helmut Weimar, when he first moved to the island in the late 70s, pitched my parents while my father was still alive on the project. So that was before 1982, and I've got photographs that go back to the early 1990s. So, but to bring a more contemporary question I have is that you said 2 weeks ago, about 33 minutes into your presentation, you said that for Zone 3, as you called, south of the existing geotubes, that lots number 83, 79, 77, and 73 were eligible for protection under local regulations. So I think I'm the one that was responsible for these sheets where I felt, where after going through all the building department records, I made the claims of those that were not eligible under our local bylaws. And these are the copies that I'm going to put into the record. But in particular, I'd like you to, if you haven't looked at this, look at number 77 Baxter Road here. And tell me what you think.
We submitted the backup for that table with the materials 2 weeks ago and I think a month ago, which was collected also from building department data. So
well, very well.
Okay.
I will pass that down.
I actually had a question mark on that lot when I went through the list as well, but
unless my math is really off.
Yeah.
Everything I put in here is accurate. So, thank you.
Yeah. And if we can be provided a copy of that, since the
Yeah.
hearing's still open. So
it's the building permit for the property. Application.
Make sure with me, I'll make sure everyone gets a copy of it.
Yeah.
Thank you.
I do want to take one opportunity to point out that when we're talking about a project like this, if you identify one house or one lot or even a couple of them that might not qualify for pre-78, I'm not saying that one does or doesn't, but just in general, what you end up with is a lot that qualifies for erosion protection that's not a coastal engineering structure. And so if we did coastal engineering structures all the way down that were geotubes and then had 2 or 3 spots where you had something softer, I don't think that actually makes any sense, and I don't think any of you would suggest that that's a good way of addressing the situation, to put soft spots in the middle intermittently in a hard structure. So I think what we have already been approved here is the idea that we have pre-78 houses that qualify for coastal engineering structures, and behind those we have the road and infrastructure that qualifies for protection, and we have a couple of lots that have houses on them that are clearly post-78 or may have been altered, but that it's still justifiable to approve this project with the coastal engineering structure being solid from end to end, because having gaps in between has consistently been determined to be not beneficial by you and by the state DEP. So, rather than nitpicking one or two of those, I'd really like to just focus on if we have the legal justification here, and if we've designed a system that you find approvable, and if you have concerns about the design, how would you like to see it changed in a way that addresses those concerns, so that we have used the most reasonable and best methods possible. That's our goal here. I think your goal and our goal is the same, to have a system that meets the legal standards and to have a system that provides the best protection, both to the bluff as a way to manage and protect against stormwater, and also to protect the beach and downdrift and locations. Yeah. Yeah. So, I mean, under the state definition, we qualify here under nearly all of these lots, and you have already granted waivers in the last version for one or two of these lots, and I think the legal standard is the same now.
I just have a comment about public infrastructure. Seems like the two infrastructures we're looking at are the Bluff Walk and Baxter Road. And first, the Bluff Walk, I'm not sure it's a path. I don't think it's a structure. And I think the solution to that is just to keep moving it back. As if the bank erodes, move the path back. And I know that encroaches on people's yards, but it seems to be sort of a sacred cow out there that if it's that important.
I'm sorry, Ernie, do you mean to move it closer to the houses?
Yeah. I know, like, Mass Audubon granted the town sort of a moving route to get out to Smith's Point. As the beach eroded, they could move that back and stay on the beach, and we did that to settle a taking issue. So I know it's possible to do things like that. And then Baxter Road, I think, this whole project started as an emergency to give the town time to move Baxter Road back. And I think the town has planned that and even has it ready to go out to bid. So I think the town has provided us with the reasonable alternative to Baxter Road, which is to move it back like this whole thing was predicated on originally.
So those are really, really good points that I'd like to address. The first one is that the Sconset Bluff Walk has no legal ability to move back. It's not a rolling easement that moves back with the bluff. It's in a fixed location. And that's why, unfortunately, as the erosion has impacted the area where it is, the Bluff Walk has been lost there. I agree with you that it's not a large piece of infrastructure, but it's certainly a piece of public access that I think the Commission and the community enjoys and wants to protect if it can be done. It's not in itself a sole justification, but if we could do this project in a way that maintains that public access and to the wetland scenic views, I think that's a huge benefit to the public and to the environment to maintain both the natural erosion that's currently there and the public access to that along the Bluff Walk. If we enter into a expansion project here, it is possible that we could come up with ways to change the existing easement so that there was additional and preserved public access, but it's certainly not going to be something that it just exists if there's no protection in place. You're talking about essentially moving from the edge of people's yards deeper into their yards up against people's houses. That's not something the town has the ability to, I guess the town could do an eminent domain taking, but there would be significant economic damages involved with that. I don't foresee that as happening. So if it's in the interest of the Commission to see the Bluff Walk continued, we would like to see it continued both in its current location and potentially in a relocation location as necessary. In terms of I'm sorry, now I forgot your second point. Oh, the road. So there is an alternative access agreement in place, but that it doesn't do what I think you just thought it did, because all it does is create a path to get from essentially along the edge of the golf course to the back of the north side of Baxter Road. Essentially, if there was a breach in the current location, it would create an alternative entrance and exit. There's no plan to actually move back Baxter Road. What we've looked at it is, can you give all of these houses frontage on the other side? Is there a way to move the road? And the only thing you could basically do is the road layout itself is slightly larger than the constructed way, and you could move the road back a little. But the problem is all of the utility lines and pipes and wires and all that kind of stuff is in there. So you'd essentially be you'd have to relocate all of that infrastructure to get another 10 feet. I'm not sure that the decision has been made that is economically viable. But there's no plan that would move Baxter Road. There's only a plan that would create an emergency access to the North Point if there's a break in the middle. And I think that when DEP originally put in its order that there should be reporting on the plan to do that, they didn't necessarily understand, or they didn't know, but they also didn't understand what the logistics were and whether the road could be relocated. I think the town has in other circumstances, like at Sheep's Pond Road and a couple of other places, and been able to, through conservation land and otherwise, been able to take a lost road and recreate it somewhere else. And we just unfortunately have not had the opportunity or the ability to do that here. So I think what we're looking at is, again, protecting Baxter Road and these houses through a non-coastal engineering structure, protecting them through a coastal engineering structure that meets the regulations and provides the best protection and the best mitigation possible. And I think we've met the legal burden to get over the hump for a CES, and that we're presenting the best designed CES and the best designed mitigation plan. And if you'd like to see changes to those, we're happy to explore them. But unfortunately, unlike other areas where you can essentially abandon and retreat, there's no physical or legal way to do that here.
Actually, I got a quick question for you, Stephen. Do you know this alternative access that's been developed? Do you know up to what lot it goes to? How far along Baxter Road it would cover?
You mean where the location of it is?
Well, I mean, yeah, generally, what lots would it serve? Relatively up to what point, and then it.
What's the
I think
address?
once the road is set, don't they go?
Well, I don't know. I'm just wondering.
Yeah. So the location of the access point is right about along where the golf course ends, where the houses are.
Yep.
So, or it's in one or two lots from there. So how many lots would be serviced by it? Sort of a sense depends on where there would be a breach on the northern side. It could
I
be.
get your point.
It could be 5 lots. It could be 10. But it's designed so that it would service any lot on the northern side
On
of
the
a breach.
northern stretch of the road, I got your
Yeah.
point. As opposed to a secondary access along the backside.
Right.
It's not that. Okay.
It's not that, but I know that we've been fortunate in other areas where we've essentially taken a lot from the front of the house and moved it to the back, and everybody gets some more time out of it, and then they can retreat, and you might get 50 years or something. We don't seem to have that ability here to relocate the road.
Okay, we've never seen this actual, what they came up with, so only heard about it. So thank you.
Okay.
Appreciate it.
Sure.
I guess I have a question that's kind of along the same lines, because as far as I read our regulations, we can't permit a coastal engineering structure in front of gap lots and, pre or post 78. That's kind of been our standard. But I'm wondering which lots or which areas we're just protecting the infrastructure, and if the town has weighed in on that infrastructure needing protection. Because I know with this first permit at the northern end, the town had weighed in, like, yes, this road is threatened, we need the protection. As far as I have heard, or the evidence we have, the infrastructure isn't currently threatened or needing that protection per the town.
In other words, it's not an imminent danger.
Well, that's for you to determine, essentially, if you think that if there was no protection there, if the infrastructure would be in imminent danger. And I think the standard that we've been working with is essentially something that's within 50 or 70 feet of the
I thought it was
bluff.
30 feet. I believe, in the first go-around.
Yeah, but 25 is where the town has established a mark that if it got that close, that they would likely close the road, or at least engineer out to determine if the road should be closed. But that, when you're talking about, is a loss. That's not imminent danger. That's where they would determine that there was a technical loss.
So how close are we to that imminent danger in the lots that we're saying, we're gonna put coastal engineering structure because the road is threatened? Are we talking 50 feet, 100 feet in some cases?
So if you were to take the position that being as close as 25 feet could be considered a technical loss, and 50 feet is where you're in imminent danger, nearly every lot here is within 75 feet of the bluff, or the road is within, there's almost nothing that's longer than that. Does that answer your question?
On the east side of the road.
Correct.
Yeah.
I'm just curious as to I don't remember what year it was, but it was the year of Sandy that, kind of predicated this whole thing when there was like the up to 30-foot lost on the bank.
13, yeah.
Okay, so what year storm was that? 100 years? I mean, I don't know if it was a single storm. If I remember right, there was like Sandy and then 2 nor'easters right after that. So the bank really got pounded. But how, what's the odds of that happening? Is that a 100-year, a 500-year event? Does anybody know?
Yeah, I think that we could figure that out. I know that the data that we've submitted already has a chart that shows what level of storms were during various years. But I'll remind you, Ernie, I'm sure you remember pretty well that the areas that lost the most during those storms were areas that were protected by the bags, the core roll-up bags that had non-coastal engineering structures, where there was a storm that came in and wiped out those bags, and then another storm that came in after that and undermined the tow. So it didn't really take much to cause, 20 or 30 feet of damage in those situations. It was the succession of the storms that caused the problem more than the severity of the storms, although they were pretty bad.
And what's the life expectancy of this project? Is it measured in tens of years, hundreds of years, forever?
Do you mean the product or the project?
Well, these bags, what's the life expectancy of the current installation? And then would the idea be to keep replacing it as it goes on, I suppose?
Well, perpetual is, if you're asking if the project is perpetual, the answer is yes. Just like every other permit that people are coming in applying for here.
In the product itself, as we provided the data in the written response last week, but we're talking about many tens of years that this product will last. Obviously, keeping it covered with sand does 2 things. One is it provides material sediment for the littoral drift system. Number 2, it protects the bags, the materials from UV damage, so it will allow it to last longer. Some similar projects with these products down in New Jersey have been in place for well over 20 years and aren't showing any signs of weakness or damage. So we're talking about a product that can last many tens of years, up to 100 years or so, if it's covered with sand.
I have a question about public access. I
Sure.
noticed in your answers to your questions, you mentioned that stairs would terminate on the top of the structure, and then people would have to go down the ends. In your old application 2-3 years ago, when you were talking stone, you had a whole bunch of ideas of having public access across the top of the structure and access from each end and stairs in the middle. And I'm wondering why you dropped that for this particular project. I mean, it seems, the old structure would have been covered with sand, and this structure has to be covered with sand.
Yeah, we could work in stairs where you essentially had a fixed set going to the top of the template, and then a removable or temporary set or adjustable set that was a little safer. What we don't want to end up with is, you can't puncture the bags, so you'd have to be, more careful with what you were doing in that last section. But it's certainly, from a design and engineering point of view, capable of having, access all the way down. I think what we want to do is look at where those stairs are actually coming, and does it make sense to, if it's only 50 feet, probably doesn't make any sense. If it's hundreds or, if it's really far, then you want to give people up and down points that are sooner. I know that there are, just as an example, a number of stairs along Tom Nevers that have the last 20 or 30 feet is retractable. In the winter, they pull it up, and, certainly something like that we could figure out. Yeah.
Yeah, were the stairs that you were mentioning in your answers, were they public access stairs or were they private stairs? They were public? Well, they have locks on them. So. Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
We could certainly put in there that anything that was public would be marked that way.
So Andy, are you asking for a revised application that actually shows stairs to give access to the public?
Well, I would think so. If it gets approved, I think public access is critical. Even if some people say people don't walk down there, I think the principle that's what makes Nantucket so great, is the public access of all beaches.
Yeah.
And the structure does at high tide, and currently there's some points that you can't get around. So.
Well, one of the reasons why you don't see a lot of people there is because it's hard to, get in. Once you start going, you got to go a couple miles.
I know.
Right. So adding intermittent stairs would actually make it more publicly accessible, because people would be able to take shorter areas.
Right.
Redesigning it and putting it a condition that there would be public access at specified points, and that would be a notice at the top or the bottom that there was a public access point. That's certainly something we could do.
Right. You have to be a billy goat to get up those ramps right now. It's soft, but I wouldn't mind seeing something.
We are talking about proposing steps from the bluff down.
Correct.
Yeah.
Although you could possibly, it's your project, but you could possibly have access from the walk, the top of the bank walk. So.
Right, and there's also there are various public rights of way that go through on lots.
Exactly.
This is a discussion we've had before, I believe.
Yeah, I think
it seems pretty simplistic. But I just wanted your comment on that.
Yeah, I think that's a no-brainer to increase the both for public safety and public access, to increase that up-down traverse.
Other questions?
Yeah, I have one more. I still have concerns about this notion of sand storage offshore. It seems to be a contradiction to say there's sand storage offshore, but we're not seeing any impact of covering bottom habitat. And I don't know if it's not covering the bottom habitat, where is it? Especially, with the notion that we need to build the project to be ready for that 30 to 40 foot erosion year, but we're not having the sand in the system. Again, if you lose 30 feet of bank, you're losing a cubic yard per foot of height, which means you're losing on average 60 some cubic yards per linear foot. And I just don't see where that's stored offshore, if it's not affecting the bottom.
Well, right now, where it's eroding, that sand is going in. And I think, Gordon Thompson went through that, how the sand doesn't necessarily go right into the system right away. It comes down, at first it's on the beach, and then it's on the swash zone, and then it moves into the littoral system, and then it moves into offshore shoals. And, this is getting outside of my area of expertise, obviously, but it's not like it just comes and sits, right offshore and moves up and down. Currently, here or anywhere. If we didn't have the current system and you were just losing the natural erosion rate, in some years it might cover the bottom, and some years it might not. What we want to do is make sure that we're providing enough sand that it's happening so that we're not having starvation, but we're not also drowning the cobble, because obviously that's important fish habitat and vegetation. One of the things that we're doing as part of this is to have the offshore video monitoring to make sure that that doesn't happen. Because if there was a long-term coverage, that would have a significant negative impact on the vegetation and on the marine life.
And the 30 feet of loss isn't along the whole 4,000 feet at any one time. Again, it's episodic and it's punctuated locations that we see those big chunks, and then other areas don't have those big chunks. So we're not losing 30 feet along the whole, 4,000 feet or 1,000 feet. So, that's, in terms of that total volume, it's, we don't see that. And as, we mentioned a couple of, hearings ago with that whole description of the sediment from the bank, it doesn't go right from the bank out into the ocean, but it moves from the bank to the beach, to the, to the swash zone, to the breaker zone, and then it moves along shore in the breaker zone generally.
Yeah, Gordon's description was great. We appreciated it. And we all felt he had it perfectly. Actually, one of his points, which I thought was really important, was the fact he had mentioned that having constant nourishment in the system during an event subdues that break zone where the waves are breaking, and is so defined on that beach with the way it drops off. And, add strength to the argument that you always need something in the system to subdue, to reduce that energy right there, because that makes all the difference.
Yeah, and as part of Gordon's presentation too, he showed the Woods Hole Group profiles, and you can see the changes. You can see sand moving offshore, so it does move offshore. It showed it nicely. And though some of the video we looked at, we're looking way offshore, so it's beyond where you would see that type of sediment transport.
I have another question. Earlier when I asked about the template and being able to quantify if it would have donated more or less, you said that one of the ways you would know to adjust the template is if we notice downdrift beaches being starved of sand. And I'm just wondering how then we as a commission, because it would probably be on us to prove that it's the lack of sand or an adjustment needed to their system that's impacting the downdrift beach, and it's not just a year of high erosion, because I'm worried we'll never be able to quantify or prove that it was something about this project that's actually starved the beaches to be able to adjust the project. Like, I just don't see the regulation there for us.
Yeah. Well, but Ashley, what we're going to have is two things. One is real-time assessments of how much sand is being lost, both at the project and nearby, but also we'll have the survey data showing us the natural rate of erosion and whether or not that is increasing. So it's not just a matter of measuring starvation, it's a matter of measuring somewhat real-time activity and also the impact of the speed of the natural rate of erosion. So if we see, like how Joe mentioned, that there was something that happened that's way off the numbers, we could react to that. Or like you're saying, if the rate of natural erosion seems to be increasing, then we can react to that. And we're looking at more surveys more frequently than any other project anywhere.
Right. I just don't know, again, how, because when you first started presenting this project, you said it's not necessarily this project causing erosion on either side. That erosion would be happening, and it just is a sticky spot for us.
So so that's absolutely true. Because
right, so then I'm just wondering how we would quantify that it's not the natural erosion and it's something about the system that's causing the starvation.
The beauty of this proposal is that you're not required to prove causality, okay? We're applying with adaptiveness. So if you see a change, you don't have to say, oh, SBPF's project caused that change. You just have to say SBPF's project now needs to adapt to that change. So if there's a problem, we adapt to resolve it. We don't make you come and say, prove it was us folks, and then we'll think about it, and then we'll get in a lawsuit, and then we'll deal with this and that and the other thing. The whole runaround that I think you're worried about. We're dealing with an issue and a response that's easily quantifiable and frequently measured. And that adaptive approach is not anywhere, you don't have the ability to do that in any of your other orders at the moment.
So, Steve,
Yeah.
I mean, clearly there was a problem this spring. And so I think Ernie's suggestion deserves serious consideration, removing the top tubes and putting more sand there so that that sand actually is introduced into the littoral system during a heavy storm so that the overtopping is deliberate. Would you consider going back and telling us whether that is in fact practical and a good idea or not?
Yes, although I don't know if I agree with your characterization of it. I do agree with your request or your solution. And I guess what I mean by that is that if the problem, as I understand it, is that there was a time period where we weren't able to cover the bags as quickly as we would have preferred, and so the solution to that is, okay, well, if you remove a bag, you'll have more sand up there and you can more quickly get to it. I don't know that those two things are totally equal. One of the things that we're doing here is having the committed dozer that's already going to be on site, so we would have availability to move quicker. And then we're also proposing a system that has essentially 3 times the amount of sand that's going to be needed at the exposed level. So you essentially have 2 bottom levels of sand readily available. So if Ernie's suggestion is take off the top tube or change the design of the top tube so that you have more sand available, I guess I would argue, and we can have the engineers work the numbers to prove what I'm saying, is creating that capacity at the top isn't necessary because the proposal that we're having already has a tremendous amount of oversupply in that area already. The adaptive proposal covers that because what we're getting into is a system that only requires, under the CZM rules or measurements, 8.8 cubic yards, and we're putting out 22. So that backlog capacity in the new design is going to be significantly more than the current design, which doesn't have that.
Yeah, but Steve, I was out there during those storms. I've got pictures that show absolutely clearly that day after day during the storms there was no sand going in from the geotubes because they had been stripped clean of the approximately 6 cubic yards per linear foot that was there beforehand. And so, I think one of our difficulties is to how do we permit a project that doesn't starve the system. I understand that Gordon said that, it was already introduced, and you made the analogy of someone's breakfast, but the bottom line is, I watched it day after day, and then when I went down there afterwards, the beach was noticeably concave in front of the geotubes where the sand had been stripped during the storm.
Okay, so I think what you're saying, if I understand it, is I think there's 2 responses to that. One of them is that, you're saying, well, are you contributing enough sand? And we're saying yes, but it doesn't have to be contributed then because it was already contributed. And then if you're responding to that, well, I get that it was already contributed, but I still don't like that it's not being contributed, during the storm. And so if the question there is, can we do anything about reducing the time in which there's no contribution, which I don't think is the same thing as starvation, because the system isn't being starved even if there's a lack of contribution. But if you're, in the technical sense, because there's enough volume already in there. But if you're saying, can we still cover the tubes faster and come up with a way to make sure that there's less time where there's no contribution, the answer is we can look at that and get back to you in 2 weeks, because it's certainly a reasonable request for us to look at. Is that
Just want to mention one other thing is that last year there was 20 cubic yards per linear foot contributed off the template into the system. Okay, so that's what was contributed. There were times that it was bare, and then they were covered as quickly as they could. The adjacent unprotected bluffs contributed much less than 20 cubic yards. It was, 5 or 6 cubic yards. So the template was contributing 3 times what was contributed off the adjacent unprotected bluffs. So the material coming off the template on the annual basis, for this past year, exceeded the unprotected bluff.
Again, we're at a nodal point there, so we know that it's going to be eroding at a faster rate or giving more sand
But
at that
that also
point.
goes back to the project purpose of stabilizing the bank to protect the homes in the road. So the idea that we're using the adjacent, the surveys of the adjacent unprotected to use that. It's not a perfect control, but it is somewhat of a control to measure against what's happening on the man-made, man-managed template. And we saw more sediment coming off the template than from the adjacent unprotected bluffs. And over the storm season, that was many times more than the unprotected bluff.
So I think part of the answer is we don't actually have to have no contribution at all time, or contribution at all times in order to avoid starvation. That the system doesn't, it's okay if the tubes are uncovered and are not contributing at some points. However, minimizing that is really important both to you and to us to protect the system and to make sure that we're not causing problems that are then going to turn around and cause the system to fail, both in the physical sense and in the regulatory sense. And so, Jamie can tell you a little bit about how what happened this spring would be different if the same situation happened next spring under the system that we're proposing now, which I think might get to the question you're asking.
So in last March, where we had those 3 consecutive storms in basically a very short window, admittedly, we did have an access problem. So just getting the machine or the equipment on the beach because of the tidal run up. And then we'd end up with short windows. And so getting the right person to get that right machine available on those right days did prove to be challenging. And you guys, there's one time where we were able to get a machine out there and we were able to get half of the tubes covered in one instance after those storms, and then we lost access again. There was another instance where I think the number was 1,500. Don't hold me to it, but I think, and we've provided that information to you guys, but I think we dumped 1,500 cubic yards to the southern return, just so that there was material when we couldn't get access to the beach. So it's not that we weren't, making an honest effort, but that is the reason that we ended up getting the bulldozer specifically and dedicated to this project so that we can hit those small windows when we do have these. And that's why it's important to have as many feet of material on top of the system as we do, so we can continue to push them over in incremental lifts, essentially, after each storm. So that's what, and this year it would be different because we do have the dozer available and we do have operators locally, ready to go. So we would do a better job this time around.
I know I appreciate that you dumped that extra sand during that event. Will you have access to the new ends, the proposed ends on this project when it's extended, if we extend it,
So
do the same thing?
So I believe we would have exposure on the southern end, but I believe the northern end, actually, before I say that specific, can I just, do you have a copy of the plan? We do have access to one of them. I just want to make sure I'm saying the right thing here.
Is this machine that you have, would it be possible to, say you end up with a multi-day event and you're kind of sitting up there looking down and there's nothing you can do because you can't get on the beach. Is this a type of piece of equipment that could be lowered onto the top of the bank with a crane? No.
It's a D6 dozer,
Yeah.
and I don't know how many tons it is, but it's probably about 40 tons.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I was about to say, give me the right crane. I'll put it on there.
Don't have that crane on Nantucket.
So the idea would be to have access to that northern end, which is generally where the energy is coming from, as you guys know. We wouldn't have direct access to the southern end. But we get it close to the southern end, so that's not a very long push. But it
With
wouldn't.
the small windows that you had before, do you think with the one machine you're going to be able to handle the 4,000? And it seems like a lot for one machine.
I do think that the one machine would be sufficient because there's a big difference between when we replenish and we have to create basically a big dike and you're pushing material. Once you have that flat scenario set up on top and you're basically just carving a foot of material off, and it's a lot less passes. So delivering material for the purpose of stockpiling does take a much bigger effort and longer period of time than pushing it over the face of the system.
But if you had to, you still could keep the contacts you have to help you out. Say you had a smaller window, say you knew another storm was coming.
Yes.
They could come and help you out. I mean, that's where I'm having a major problem with this project, is just trying to keep it covered and trying to keep it covered. That's where I think that could be problematic for this.
So I believe that dozer would be sufficient to get the entire face covered in the course of like even, I think it could do it probably in a day, but maybe 2 days to get it covered, if so long as the material's on top of the system, which is the intent. But certainly if it were not the case, then, we'd have to figure it out and look into a second machine.
Would you have a little one?
A smaller machine. I mean, we would figure it out. At this point, the reason we have one is because we think it's sufficient.
Just another kind of logistical question. Oh, sorry.
I was just going to say, Joe, remember that the idea here is Jamie was mentioning that the material on the top of the template, people are saying it's not available. The idea is that that's an on-site stockpile along the entire length. As Jamie mentioned, can then be bladed down, pushed down, so that it's right there on site.
No, I
and so it's there at the beginning of the season and not, the idea is if it needed, more could be brought in, but where that's a multiple of the long-term average of what's needed, there's plenty of stockpile there so that the material, the equipment can just drive along and push it down and recover.
But like Ian said, it was exposed, so that's kind of a problem with us.
Well,
and if there are small windows that he's able to get to that project, that's another problem. So that's why I'm saying, do you have enough resources? Do you have enough equipment? Do you have enough access or communication with someone to help you out in this event?
So what we haven't experienced to date is a scenario where we had a machine on the template, but we didn't have enough time to cover it up. So there would be another scenario, like the time we covered half of it because there's a step down. There was plenty of material at one end, I believe was the case, and not at the other. So once you get somebody out there in a machine, I think if you give them a full day, they're going to be able to move material from the top of the template because you're only skimming a foot off. I mean, you're doing several passes. But, when we're moving the material out there, we have an excavator, we have a dozer, we'll have, smaller machines, sometimes a couple skid steers as needed. I think the idea is that when it's just the dozer skimming off the top of the template, that would be sufficient. But if it's not, we would figure it out one way or another. I mean, there are other machines on island, and I know these guys, when I tell them we need something, they've never said no. So.
And as we, reiterate again that the standard, the best available measures is to provide the mitigation sand what we're looking at is the annual basis. The standard throughout the Commonwealth is a one-time a year placement, and that's it. Here we're looking at having the placement of the material before the season. That's a stockpile, and then it's being placed periodically during the storm season after erosion events as quickly as possible, so that the tubes are being covered. There are going to be times when the tubes become uncovered during a storm, and the idea then, in accordance with the CZM policy of providing the material periodically, is to then recover them as quickly as we can. What we've identified in the protocol is the protocol is within 10 business days after the erosion event. So, we're providing plenty of material on an annual basis. And even this last year, which was a heavy year, where 20 cubic yards came off, when we look at that 77th survey that was provided to you from Woods Hole Group, we see that the measure that they use, the mean low water contour, has been moved seaward. So the beach has grown, the volume has increased in front of in front of the existing system, and to the immediate profiles north and south of the system. Remember that diffusion process that Gordon talked about. So this year was a big year. That material is washed off, and now it's in that part of the system. So yes, it was washed off. It was a big year. There were some times that it was exposed, but it's there in the system on the annual basis.
I think given the discussion tonight and the concern that seems to be among several of the commission members about the sand mitigation, I think if we need an independent review of anything, it's probably the mitigation plan, kind of from top to bottom, so to speak. And another couple of questions that I am curious about is we have not heard a number of how much it would cost if somewhere along the line the system fails. What's it going to cost to remove this project? Because I think we want to have some kind of a fund set aside so the taxpayers don't get stuck with removing it if that becomes the case. And we would have to, since this thing could be in there for decades, we're going to have some adjustment for inflation, and it's going to be complicated. But and then, since we talked about possibly having to bring in sand from off-island pits, do we have a grain size analysis from these pits to know that we have the appropriate sand available? Not just any old sand, but...
So let me start with the last one. Are you saying that you want us to identify potential sources and show that they physically could? Yeah, all right. We already have that. We could provide that. The current project requires an escrow of a fund to remove the project upon a failure determination, and that money is on an escrow with the town treasurer, and we would expect that condition would appear in the new project, and that the removal escrow would be increased to accommodate the additional length. I don't know what that number is. It kind of doesn't matter what that number is. It just means that if you want that condition to exist, you put it in there, and then we work out the number with the town engineer on how to quantify that. In terms of peer review, I would go slightly wider, Ernie, and make the recommendation that if you'd like to see that you have a sufficient peer review of something you're considering approving, that you would want to see a peer review of a proposed order of conditions that would include but not be limited to a mitigation plan. And I think that you might find that to be a productive way to engage an engineer. I know that the engineer that's done the review of the annual reports would probably be teed up faster than anyone to get on it, and would be able to tell you not only whether or not the mitigation plan is good, but whether or not a proposed order would be good. And I don't know if that's something that the town could react to in terms of having a contract in place or not, but that might be a useful way for you to feel like you've obtained a peer review on the widest and most applicable information, and something we'd agree to.
And just hitting on two other points that you mentioned. One, with the hitting on the peer review for the existing project, that was peer reviewed with Malone and McBroom, and in their peer review, they did identify, in the future, looking at an adaptive system, adaptive management of the template. So they had identified that as something that should be looked at going forward in the future. And now we're in the future. The other thing is, in terms of compatible sand, there is a requirement that sand being brought to the template to be put in is looked at to be it has to be compatible sand. That's part of the regulation. And the grain size analyses, the sieve analyses, are provided to Jeff before the material, when the material is identified. So the sand is looked at. Dr. Rosen, looks at the materials, look at the sieves, and compares it to the sand samples that he has taken on the beach.
Well, I have to say that's another of my concerns is that, especially if you expand this project and we approve of it, that the bluff over those 4,000 plus feet has a lot more than sand that is actually contributing naturally. Cobble, clay, you name it. And it doesn't seem to me feasible that what you're going to put on top of the tubes is going to replicate that in any way.
No, and the standard is that it's compatible to the beach that it's washing into. So the sand that's being placed is compatible to the sand on the beach. The glacial material that's washed out of the bluff is comprised of material of multi sizes. The very fines get carried in suspension and actually washed away, much further off the beach. And so the standard is compatible to the beach sand, and that's been the standard for the existing project. I think that's the standard throughout the Commonwealth for these projects. And so that's the standard that's being met here.
Can I ask you a quick question about the escrow put aside? When you mentioned the cost of removal, did you say that the town engineer had sort of helped you figure out the amount needed, or did you actually get a proposal from a contractor?
It was 3 years ago, so I don't
I
remember
understand
exactly.
that.
But my recollection is that we had a proposal and that was reviewed by the town. But I think it was someone at Malone and McBroom looked at it and said that seems reasonable. And then that money was then put on escrow with the town treasurer.
May I recommend that maybe the installers might give you a more updated version of this, and being the ones that put it in, that maybe they could give you an estimate or a better idea.
Yeah.
Real life price of what it's, so you guys would have that.
Well, you wouldn't necessarily need the installers to take it out.
They know it's there exactly. I was thinking of it that way. They may not want to take it out.
Well, we could certainly commit to providing the underlying basis for the determination to staff for approval, to make sure that you felt comfortable, or that at least that Jeff felt comfortable that what was being proposed made sense and seemed to be appropriately priced. I don't think there's anybody's advantage to lowball it and then have a situation where it's not being met.
So
They do it in Boston all the time.
What?
They do that in Boston all the time.
or maybe it is.
Come on.
if I can weigh in on that really quickly, because we've dealt with this similar situation before in other spots with other types of projects as well. The way we've been conditioning that lately is that a yearly estimate for the work be filed on an annual basis. So it's kind of a year-to-year update. So not to pick on, if they had Toscana give an estimate for the removal of the structure in 2018, the escrow amount would match that, and then they would be resupplying that estimate again in 2019 and having to adjust the amount to match that estimate. We've done that a few times to have it as kind of a year-by-year updated estimate in hand that everyone goes on public record, and then amounts to match that. So that's worked fairly well.
Okay.
And I guess it's getting people to honor their estimates afterwards, but that's a matter of public record, and I can't imagine that going on.
I just felt it was important that an actual contractor give a guesstimate on it.
The way we've been writing that again is that it has to be an estimate from a contractor capable of performing the work.
Okay.
So it can't be, Joe can't give an estimate for what he thinks it's going to take to do, and you file it away because, no offense, but Joe's not going to go out there and remove
Right.
it. So
Jamie is telling me that the original estimate came from Toscana, which is certainly, among the biggest operators on Nantucket. And I don't know that we would need it updated annually, but certainly every few years you want to make sure that the right number is there.
Right.
Every 2 or 3 years, 5 years, something like that, to make sure that the amount in escrow reflects a realistic number. Certainly 20 years in, it's not going to be sufficient
Right.
anymore.
I just had mentioned a town engineer, and I was a little suspect of your numbers. That's all.
Yeah,
Nothing at your numbers, but
I don't think we actually have a town engineer at the moment. So
okay. Do we have that? Okay. So, do we have other questions?
Yeah, I just have
Go right
one
ahead.
more. So, just back to the bulldozer question. Does the bulldozer actually need to be able to go in front of the tubes and traverse the beach at a low tide? Or is it like once it's up on the tubes, it stays there for a few days just doing its thing?
So we wouldn't want to leave it on the beach for a few days. We would always try and take it off the beach just so that it doesn't get wind, pocking on the glass and stuff from windblown sand, but we leave it at Hoyks Hollow for the duration in which we're using it at the end of the day. And I did want to point out, because Joe, on your point about efficiency and capacity relative to this machine, we did actually buy like a $40,000 laser system that has been mounted to this thing, and it's pretty sophisticated, and you can put in exactly the coordinates or the grade, and it'll maintain it as you drive. So it's a super efficient machine to run when you're doing this stuff, as far as keeping that top level and having it, it's a 6-point blade. So that helps a lot.
Yeah, and you got the stakes in there as well, so you don't have the bags.
Right. Yeah, exactly. And that all is part of the computer, actually, relative to sea level height. So.
So, but Jamie, correct me if I'm wrong, but the ramp at Hoyks Hollow was completely washed away last March, so you had to construct a new one.
That's true. I've had to do that probably 3 or 4 times at least. And so what we do in that instance is we'll bring in typically fill and just, or sand and fill, and just build it from the top down.
And how long does that take? Just a few hours?
Yeah, I mean, it's half a day usually. And you have the machine that you're going to be bringing on the beach working with the dump trucks.
So I think that you have raised some issues that you'd like to see us tighten up on, to say the least, and I think we could try to get back to you on that. I do think that if the commission is going to want to see a peer review, trying to have a proposed condition, order of conditions for the reviewer to weigh in on, both the mitigation plan and conditions make sense, and I don't know if that's something you want to think about, but we'd like to get to the point where we're having productive meetings where you look at it and say, yes, I could vote for this, or no, I couldn't, and I think getting to that finished product will give you the ability to do that. So Jeff, I don't know what your timeline is on the ability to produce something like that.
I guess the easy answer to that is our annual report reviewer is ready and waiting whenever we call. If we need something additional, we can probably secure that in a few days to get kind of everything queued up. Production of anything, really, if asked to do it, we can do it whatever time frame needs to be done. So it's not really a big concern.
Okay, do we have another meeting scheduled, or was this the last one?
We have the room booked for some additional times, but we can get to that at the end of the evening. I think seeing what issues need to be addressed and kind of timeframes for that will kind of dictate. I don't think if we're going to be getting that stuff and we're waiting for responses from issues raised, knowing what those are and what time that's going to take to produce.
Yeah.
Will kind of dictate when that is, especially given the fact that the holidays are rapidly approaching, and squeezing it in and around there and making sure that we keep a full board and everyone available is going to get trickier as time passes.
Yeah. Logistically, in my head, what I'm thinking is, how do we try to make sure that we get something in front of the reviewer before the holidays so that we could have a report back after? Because if we wait till after, it's going to take forever.
I can tell you that I don't want to say we kind of anticipating this coming, but going and having talked to the reviewer for other projects that we're working on as a town and other things, our normal reviewer, Mr. Berman from Woods Hole, I know he physically is in possession of everything. We kind of keep him up to date with what's coming in. Mm-hmm. I'll be seeing him tomorrow in person to get kind of an update on, if we know this is coming, I can kind of press him for how long he needs to produce a report. But given the past history, I can't imagine that it would take, I don't think you're looking at months by any means, but I think you'd be looking more on the scale of a few weeks to probably get it turned around with the holidays in the middle.
Yeah.
I'll know more definitively after I speak to him again for what it would be. But he's been getting all of the materials all along. We kind of keep him in the loop.
That's really, really good to know. I appreciate that. I'm sure the commission does too.
Well, the last report he did, he asked me if more stuff is coming in, if we can just kind of keep him in the loop as we're going and not just send him, hey, here's 1,000 pages of what's going on, and then getting an annual report that references other stuff that's taken place that we kind of keep him in information for what's happening, and he knows where to find it and things too. So I think he keeps up to date. If we need an additional reviewer, that obviously would take a little bit more time, but I can't imagine it being overly difficult to do.
Yeah. So I think we're seeing some themes in the questions that we could certainly be responsive to. And I don't know if the commission has more questions or if you want to open it up to the public, but I don't want to get too late and,
Right.
you know.
Okay. Okay, so if there are no more questions from the commission, I'm going to open this to the public. And any questions, please come up to the microphones and state your name.
See how this one works. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Emily Molden for the Nantucket Land Council. Throughout this hearing process, we've continued to express concerns that the mitigation program that's being implemented for the existing geotubes hasn't been providing adequate nourishment during the larger storms or the consecutive storms, like the ones we saw this past spring. And the testimony and written comments that you've received from Trey and the other coastal engineers at Applied Coastal have illustrated and documented this for the commission. I think the commission's raised some good points this evening, and it sounds as though there might be some new information coming in. But Trey is here this evening, and he submitted another letter, I believe, to the commission at the end of last week. So I'd love to just invite him to come up to speak to some of the points that he made in his last letter and allow him to answer any questions that you may have of him at this time. Thank you.
Okay.
Good evening, Trey Ruthven with Applied Coastal Research and Engineering. Thank you for having me. So it's interesting. I've sat through most of these proposals that have been up here, and the one thing that's consistent among all of them is that this project has more data than almost any other project in the state. I mean, it's fantastic in a sense. But the odd part is we don't really use it. Like, we'll be like, it's this or it's that, but we also have data. So this is where I get concerned because, you know, I can definitely look at the bluff. If you had, I'm sure you've all been at the bottom, and you look up and you can understand the concern that people have on top. It's scary. I get that. So you would think they'd be using their data and using their engineers and scientists to produce the best answer because, you know, they don't have a whole lot of room for flexibility if this doesn't work. But so you think they'd be putting their best foot forward, but all the time when I look at their data and go, well, does this make sense? My answer is generally there's critical concerns. So once again, we have critical concerns, and you know, once again, it's their data. So I just want to spend a little time talking about the first part, which I think is critical, is what are we going to do for mitigation? And so when we're computing mitigation, how much sand is this bluff giving off? And so we hear all these talks about long-term, short-term. So let's talk about long-term initially. If we go back, and I've heard them reference the CZM shoreline, you know, that's great. It's 160 years old. For the first 100 years, there was no erosion. So what does that tell us? That doesn't really tell us anything. If we want to do that, you know, we could say, hey, why don't you guys just put out 1 cubic yard a year and you guys will be fine. You don't need a system. But that doesn't really affect reality, and we all know that. So there's no point actually using it. The part where that does come up, and I'm sure you guys see this all the time with hearings, is that, you know, this project has a ton of data. There's a lot of these homeowner projects which are much smaller. There is no data. So you're searching and you're finding data to come up with answers. This is not one of those projects. This is one of those projects where you have information available. So you shouldn't have to go for these, you know, more hypothetical type answers. And actually, so then we come into the short term. Why would we want to use short term? Let's think about it. So if we look at the southern end, we started with any of these, there were dunes out front. We weren't worried about bluff erosion. So if we start moving our short term back into the dune area, we can see that you know, the bluff isn't eroding. And what we want to do going forward, because this is mitigation, is we want to mitigate for our neighbors updrift and downdrift what the bluff is currently giving and what it's going to be giving in the near future. We don't care what was happening 160 years ago. We care about what's going on in the future. And the reason we're concerned about that is that all the neighbors are also on bluffs or will be on bluffs as their dunes erode. And so if their dune or bluff erosion rate increases, we're putting them at jeopardy to save some other homeowners. Well, if we're coming up with solutions, we should look at a cohesive system and how can we benefit everyone, or at least not to the detriment of somebody else. Hence why we can't have an adverse impact. So I look at the bluff here, and I look at the time periods they use. So for the northern part, we're at 94 to 2017, and the southern part from 2003 to 2017. So I said, well, let's see how accurate they are. So I just picked profile 90 off the chart. So this is coming straight out of the Woods Hole Group report. And I look at the first period before the geotubes were in place, and I have an accretion rate of +1. That means the beach is actually accreting outward on average. So there's goes up and it goes down, but on average, it went out a foot according to their data. I look at the period afterwards, and it's eroding significantly. And the problem is they've come up with an average erosion rate, which would equal 7.7 cubic yards. When I math quickly using, top of bluff, the same method they're using, is I was up around 32.8 actually. That's significantly more than 7.7. And this is just me running a quick check on their numbers to say, hey, does this make sense? Are what they presenting making sense? Is this representing the system? And this is also where I question, why are you shortchanging the littoral system when you have houses on top? This is where my logic as an engineer comes into question. And we'll hear this a lot, like, well, erosion's really bad, we need something. But when we want to mitigate, erosion's not that bad, the number's really small. And you can't have both ways. I mean, if you're looking for this cohesive system, you need to look at everything and actually just provide, here's the answers. And I don't see that happening. So then we get into DEP policy and CZM policy. What are you guys required to do by the state for mitigation? They do ask that you look at long-term, but they also ask that you look at short-term. They also specifically state that you should look at what is the bluff going to give off into the future. They want you to look at the whole picture, provide a full discussion, which we're getting some of, but not all of it. And then come up with a mitigation rate so the neighbors are not adversely impacted. So if next year we're going to be giving off, let's say, 20 cubic yards per linear foot, we need to prevent that from happening by not taking last 5 years, which might have been 10, but we need to go what's going on in the future to prevent those adverse impacts. In my normal day, I speak with DEP and CZM all the time, so I've actually had conversations, and they all agree. They said, using the long term, and it's a case like this, doesn't really apply. We have data. We should be using the data. The reason why we'd use a CZM shoreline is if we're in some bay or something like that and we have no data, that might be our best answer. We can look for other ways to fill in those answers. But in this case, that's not this project. We have data we can use. They've been doing this for 25 years. I mean, reams of data. The other problem I just wanted to point out while I was reviewing the data reports, and this is kind of a aside for what we're really talking about, but I think it's important, is that if you guys look at the monitoring report, on the bottom it says, this document contains confidential information is proprietary to Woods Hole Group. Neither the entire document or any information contained therein should be disclosed, reproduced in whole or part beyond the intended purpose of this submission without express written consent of Woods Hole Group. These are public documents. I'm not sure why we're actually having SBABF or Woods Hole Group kind of document or dictate the use of them. I mean, this is what's being provided to the commission. It just seems like it's haltering that public information process and probably should be removed in the future reports so people don't feel intimidated about using that data. So I've talked about, I see erosion increasing. So the question is, I looked at profile 90 quickly, and that's just 1 or 7. So now the question is, what are we doing overall? Is it just a amorphous profile? Because we'll see differences along the bluff as it goes on. We'll have sand waves come up and come down, so erosion will mix and move. If we have a lot of bluff erosion, it might actually push the beach out for a few years. So what I did is took the shoreline data again, and I plotted the period before the geotubes went in place and the period after geotubes have been in place. And you can see this graph, and it's in a number of my letters that I've submitted. The one thing that's interesting is if you look at the red line, which is post-geotubes, erosion has increased since the geotubes went in place. It's just a fact that this is their data. So we are having a possible impact. And so then we kind of look at their explanation like, well, we're giving off more sand than we're expecting through this mitigation program. Everything's hunky-dory. And my question is, and you guys can think about this and kind of develop your own answer is, we have a system that's 900 feet long. We have 22 cubic yards on it. And if you look at table 2 in any of the monitoring reports, you can see that, the overall profile, so that goes from the top of the bluff out, it's losing less sediment than it has in the past. And that goes all the way from, Squidneck Quam all the way down. The question is, can a 900-foot system do that? And the answer is no, it can't. The reason we're seeing more sediment in the system is erosion's increased. We're giving off more sediment from the bluff. That's where that volume's coming from. It's not this mitigation. It's just something you can tag onto it. I mean, think about the volume that's required across the entire monitoring transects. It's a huge section. So that's the bluff giving it off. Once again, that suggests to us that we need to look at what the bluff erosion rates are currently. What's that volume actually giving off? And we hear last year we gave off 20 cubic yards. And that's fantastic. What would the system have given off if it could provide it the entire time? Would it have been 30? Would it have been 40? Would it have been an order of magnitude more? All are very potential. I mean, then we look at other projects. You know, we've heard this, like, again, we've compared this to 10 other projects on Cape and in the islands. And the conditions here are slightly different. We're giving off more. Each of those projects have a mitigation volume depending on where they are. We're at Sconset. This is one of the highest eroding bluffs in the country. Of course it's going to have a higher rate than, you know, somewhere in Cape Cod. I wouldn't expect Falmouth to have an erosion rate anywhere close to this, nor would I expect the mitigation volume to be the same. So you can't just draw those simple, straight conclusions. Once again, this project has data. We can use this data. We can come up with actual volumes of what's needed. And Gordon did provide a really great, I watched the video about how the sediment system works. But the one point I would disagree with or contend that you need to think about is we give off sand. Sand's it's not an element, but it's conservative. It's not going to disappear. It moves up and down the system. However, once that sand's been in the system for a while, it's probably long gone. It's not actually within the project area where we're trying to actually mitigate for the damages. And also that sand, once it's in the offshore bar, it's available in the system, but is it actually mitigating to prevent damage on neighboring coastal banks? Because if it's not, we're actually having an adverse impact on our neighbors again, because we are not providing sand when it's needed. We're covering up the coastal bank, which is actually providing a distinct buffer that actually reduces storm energy during those events. We're not worried about July, we're worried about nor'easters. That's when we're having problems. And if we take away that natural mechanism for giving off dispersing wave energy, we're having an adverse impact. Those erosion rates on neighboring bluffs are going to increase because they don't have that sediment available. The offshore bar, that's not really going to be important at that point. That's when we need it. That's what we've been saying all along. We need an actual volume of what the bank is contributing. You know, the north side, south side, and all in between. But then also to deliver it when it's needed. And one other point I wanted to talk, Ian and Ernie had requested or were thinking about changing out the fourth tube. The one thing you need to keep in mind is if you were changing out the fourth tube over the March storms, it wouldn't have gotten wet. If you were looking to try to adapt the system so it would give off more sediment and kind of a catastrophic type failure, you'd probably need to take out the top two tubes. But the fourth tube wasn't exposed, it was the third tube that was exposed. So just kind of keep that in mind as you're batting around ideas. I mean, just replacing the fourth tube is not going to be the end all. So just keep that in mind. Thank you.
Thank you. Other questions? Could you just give your name, please?
My name is Warren Wagner. I'm here to submit a letter that my wife Judith has written. She couldn't be here today to do this because of a family emergency, but I know she spent a whole lot of time with the old records and the old land deeds, and she's particularly interested in public rights and beaches. So she's summarized this in 7 pages worth. I don't know that I'm attorney enough to help you with it. I'm not going to read it to you, but I am going to mention the very last line, judithwagner@gmail.com. You write her a letter any time of the day or night, and she'll respond. She sent this to me at 4 last night. So take a look. I hope it's some help. So thank you.
I'll just say really quickly, we did get that today. I know I sent back the received it, so it'll be up in the next group of comments that we post probably in the morning. And I would definitely encourage everyone to to look at it. It's very thorough from my going through it. So
Yeah, I saw it this morning and realized it was more than I could handle before work.
yes.
It was very thorough. Thank you. Please.
Good evening. My name is Rick Atherton, and I just had a couple of comments. One, in terms of the commission receiving some advice from non-applicant professionals. I mentioned that a couple of sessions ago, and I see you're back on that again today. And I would encourage that, assuming we get some advice, that he also, or that person also look at the alternatives presented in the application. An application is presented by a party that wants a result, and therefore the alternatives presented are usually presented in a format so that they will be rejected as quickly and promptly as possible. And I'd suggest that you be cautious about that. You go back to a prior application, I think this was 2012, one of the alternatives rejected was geotubes. So that just gives you a sense of how these things can move around depending on the desire of the applicant. So I just wanted to bring that to your attention. I also want to say that I think the Nantucket community owes a real debt of gratitude to the Land Council. Without their providing expert professional advice, the only advice you seem to get is from the applicant and their paid consultants. And I, as one member of the community, have found that the Land Council provides broad community advice. They are truly interested in conservation and preservation. And I think we need to pay close attention when they come before you. In the letter Applied Coastal has presented, when you go to the bottom of page 2 and read the last 2 or 3 sentences, I think they summarize what really you ought to pay close attention to. I think there are alternatives. We're putting core logs all around the island on other beaches which have high erosion rates, and then we're putting sand on top of them. I'm not sure why that wouldn't also work here. It would use up less of the beach, which is also ought to be a protected area you're interested in conserving. Geotubes take up how many feet of beach and kill that portion of the resource. So I think you just pay close attention to the material provided to you. Thank you.
Thank you.
Hey, Rick.
We totally agree with the benefit the Land Council's helped in all our projects. So, Dan?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Deanne Atherton from the Nantucket Coastal Conservancy. And the group I speak on behalf of are not experts. We're not scientists. We get lost in the technicality of a lot of this. But we have paid attention, and we are informed, concerned citizens. So our comments that we submit to you are really in a very different vein, and I hope that you'll consider them. We did submit to you 15 key points that we would like you to consider. We know you have a lot to read, so we're trying to be very specific in what we're bringing to your attention. And we do have a longer narrative that provides more detail for those key points, and we will be submitting that probably tomorrow. But just to hit on a couple things we wanted to communicate to you is that, first of all, we want you to understand, and it's totally out of your purview, but you need to know it because it's in the ether, that when the select board voted to sign, give its assent to the submission of the NOI, it was very, very specific in stating that they made no judgment about the merit of this project. And in fact, they were looking to you to advise them. And I just think that's important to keep in context. I just know if I were sitting there, I'd wonder, are we being, asked to sort of agree to something that we might not think is in the best interest? To a layperson who's just watching this, it just seems to me that the current installation and the proposed expansion adversely impact the wetland resources that you're charged to protect. It's as simple as that. We're talking about the beach, which is protected by law. Some of the examples are, and Rick mentioned to this, we didn't know anything about geotubes 5 years ago, but we do know now. We know how invasive, for instance, even the installation project is. Just that process, what that does to the beach. The machinery coming all the way down from Hoyks Hollow, all along a natural beach. So that amount of beach habitat, acres, I don't know, would have to compute it, is immediately destroyed by the geotubes. We're not talking about that. I mean, that's a living, breathing beach that's destroyed under those geotubes. There's no mitigation for that. Are we going to mitigate somewhere else and, replace the natural beach that we've lost? I haven't heard any of that in the discussion. I did learn from the fishermen that offshore cobble habitat is formed a very unique reef, a fish nursery that's unique to New England, even the whole Atlantic coast, Bobby DaCosta will say. And you have to wonder, by walling off the bluff that provides that unique geological material that creates that cobble habitat, what is that doing to it? How is it impacting the land under the water, land under the ocean in that sense? The public's use and enjoyment of the beach for recreational purposes has been severely eroded. I mean, degraded. We can see that in 5 years. There are many times the public can't even get by on its own beach. Even more, I think, obvious is the transformation of this entire area into a perpetual construction site, since it's going to require mitigation, maintenance, and monitoring forever. The fact that we have a dedicated bulldozer, just highlights that fact, because there's construction machinery on that beach. As has been touched on, the permitting history of the current project is very revealing, and some of you are new to the commission, and I think that when someone gets up and says, well, this 900 feet project is something that you permitted, as if you approved that, and Dr. Steinauer did review that a little bit. The permitting history was brought before you by the applicant, and we all need to remember that the commission voted twice to deny a 900-foot project that is essentially the same as this expanded installation would be. They even voted to appeal the state superseding order to a superior court. And it was only when a majority of the select board would not provide the funds for the appeal that, at least to the public, it seemed, since the appeal wouldn't be funded, the pressure was brought on the Conservation Commission to settle and to permit the project. That was a much different time. There was an emergency. The project before the commission was a joint application from the town and SPPF. That's not the case now. We have asked very direct and simple questions. And so many questions have been answered and so much time is spent, but we've asked how many days have the geotubes been uncovered? And I couldn't answer that. We haven't been told the answer to that. How many days or tide cycles has the beach in front of the geotubes been impassable? We don't know. We have, citizens go up and take pictures and they can't get by in front of the geotubes. Susan Landman went up on Thursday and the geotubes are uncovered. I think it's important, we'd like you to put the size of the project into perspective. This project is longer than we know of, and the amount of sand required, as shown in the calculations that we've submitted, is enormous, requiring thousands of dump truck loads on our roads at a cost of several million dollars each year in sand alone. And we have ignored the cost of repairing the wear and tear on our roads caused by the dump trucks, or the impact on sand, cost and availability for other uses on the island. We are leaving tomorrow, a number of us, to go to the Cape Coastal Conference in Hyannis to learn more about resiliency and developing a coastal resiliency plan. And we find it, quite frankly, ironic that at a time when coastal communities are adopting coastal resiliency strategies to create undeveloped waterfront areas to buffer the impacts of increasing storm events, that we are seriously considering just the opposite. Hard armoring 3,800 linear feet of a natural beach. We believe the alternative analysis in the NOI is incomplete. The soft installations have been in place for some time and have had 5 additional years to demonstrate their effectiveness side by side with the geotubes. Let's look at that. How have they performed relative to the geotubes? There are now 2 additional relocation alternatives that we didn't have 5 years ago. The whole purpose the 900 feet was permitted was for a temporary project to give the town time to develop alternative access. The town now has shovel-ready plans, and we will be submitting those to you in the document that we send you later tonight or tomorrow. And we understand that there are bidding documents now out, and the town is ready to provide alternative access to those properties that are located on the most threatened area of northern Baxter Road. A second alternative that was not before the commission 5 years ago was demonstrated by the owner of 109 Baxter, and he received permission from the town to move his house westward into the road layout. That road layout is 60 feet wide. He got a license or a lease from the town. He moved his house, moved it back out of harm's way, and sold it. Every house that's threatened along the east side of Baxter Road could consider that relocation alternative. So they can't say we have no room left on which to move our house back. We could also conceivably, there's a 10-foot strip on either side of Baxter Road. Baxter Road could be relocated all the way to the west of the layout, and that would give 20 additional feet on the eastern side, all along the whole length of Baxter Road. And finally, about the Bluff Walk. I know a lot about the Bluff Walk because when I was on the Roads and Right-of-Way Committee, Harvey Young and I chaired the Sconset Footpath Public Access Subcommittee, and we spent a lot of time. Those staircases that go from the Bluff Walk down to the beach all are open to the public, or they should be open to the public because they go over town-owned land. So any of those staircases that say locked or have a lock on them or say private are either illegal because they haven't been permitted, or there are a few lots south, sort of mid-Baxter, that go all the way down to the water, but they're very few. So it's no concession to say we would put staircases in. Those staircases are all in there, and it's all of public access. And in fact, Jeff, you probably remember when a member of our subcommittee worked with you and Joanne, I think, to do a whole matrix of which staircases were properly permitted and which weren't. And there were many more that are illegally installed than are properly permitted, as I recall. At any rate, we hope you will look at our key talking points. And again, they're not as technical or as expert as other comments. We like to think that they're common sense comments. And we hope you'll consider them. Thank you.
Mr. Chairman, there are some people who are just against this project. They're going to continue to be against this project. They're going to continue to point out that when you change something, it has changed, and we don't deny that. They're going to continue to point out that we can't, have perfect, and we don't deny that. What we're asserting is that we meet the legal standard, and we're providing the best available measures in engineering and in mitigation. So, Joe Biden says, compare me to the alternative, not the almighty, and that's what I'd ask you to do too. Look at this project for the legal standard that it's proposed under, look at the engineering that's proposed, and look at the mitigation that's proposed. And I think you'll find that it's approvable and that it's frankly the best project in the Commonwealth, if not the East Coast. I do want to make a couple of quick factual points, which is that the alternative access, it's a perpendicular access at the northern point to allow for ingress and egress, but it's only available in the event the protection is permitted and maintained. In other words, if the breach occurs because the geotubes are ripped out, the people that have allowed the legal right of access don't have to give it. So it's not, people have not supplied the knife to cut their own throats here. And the town is not taking that through eminent domain. So you should not fall for the idea that this is not necessary anymore because that access exists. That access exists in conjunction with this, not as opposed to it. And then the other thing is that Applied Coastal said we should be looking at the short-term data and all the data we're using and not looking at the 100-year numbers. And we totally agree with them, which is why that's exactly what we're doing. I'd love to see the calculation that Trey came up with that is 5 times greater than ours. I'm not going to calculate it, but I think it's pretty relatively simple math. I'd like to see why he's 7 times over, and either he's right or he's wrong. And if he's right, that it's going to speak for itself. But I'm getting a little tired of people just pointing out stuff what we already know, which is that there's a way for this to be permitted and that it has an impact and that we are required to deal with it. We could keep going around and around and around on that forever, but I think what we really need to do is focus on the rule of law, the state regs, the state laws and regulations and your rules and regulations and the applicability of that to this situation. At the end of the day, these homeowners have a legal right to protect their property and have a legal right to meet your regulations to do that. And that's what I think we need to focus on here, is how do we provide the best available project and the best available mitigation to meet those legal standards. It's not really going to be a choice of abandonment or not. I know that Dan Atherton always likes to talk about Dr. Young, and Dr. Young suggests that we should retreat and abandon and move into the conservation lands, and that sounds nice, but it's not going to happen. We're either going to protect this one way or another, and the question is, what does the law allow, and what's the best engineering and mitigation way to get there? And so we'll get back to you at the next meeting with some responses to some of the questions that were raised by the public and some of the questions that were raised by the members of the commission. And I guess what I'd like to know from you is, when do you think is the appropriate time to continue to?
The appropriate time when?
When would you like to have the next meeting?
Oh, thank you. Jeff?
I think he's looking at a calendar.
Well, I think the question is, how long is it going to take to get the peer review done, get new information in from the questions tonight?
Yeah, I think what would be productive would be to have materials into the commission, so that so that the next meeting could produce the whatever the peer reviewer was going to look at, so that we could then likely come back, and you could have that at the following meeting.
No, I agree. Just kind of looking at the schedule, I mean, next week is obviously too soon. And then the following week, we have a regular hearing on Wednesday. Then the week after that is Christmas. And then the week after that is New Year's. So,
Could we do it the Monday of your regular meeting? Is that a time you have? When's the next time that you have the room scheduled?
not for a while. The next time we have definitively booked this room, even though I think given the size of the audience that we've been getting, I think we could probably use this room or the room upstairs if needed. Just from the attendance that's been there. There's a lot of availability on if we stay on Mondays in those times. If we did like Monday the 17th, which is our regular meeting week, that would be, we could do probably a regular 4 o'clock upstairs. FinCom will be down here that day. And NPDC is that day down here as well. That would be the 17th. The next time I have definitively booked this room for this purpose is honestly in January, just because the room gets a little more jammed up.
I think it would be worthwhile to have one more meeting on the 17th.
So I won't be here on the 17th, and I feel I don't like this feeling of being jammed up by SBPF, and I would prefer that we waited until January after the holidays.
I was just asking about a date. I wasn't trying to jam anybody up. But Ian, you haven't missed a meeting, have you?
Excuse me?
You have not missed any meetings, have you?
I have not.
Yeah.
No, you did. Yeah.
You did.
You called this one, yeah. Well, you still missed it.
Oh,
That doesn't, you've missed one.
okay.
Yes, you'd be.
Well, there you go. Okay.
So we can't do that.
17th, you're on.
No, that doesn't mean that. Sorry.
Yes, please.
Good evening, George Pucci from Town Council's office. Just to prove I'm awake, I have been awake the whole time, but I did just want to clarify, because I didn't mean to be rude to yell out. You did actually miss that meeting that the connection stopped. So we want to make sure you stay eligible to vote on this. You can only miss one, even if you wave in. So I would, just suggest we make sure that we're available. Ernie, you've missed one as well. So I would keep that in mind. That doesn't mean that you need to meet on the 17th.
So
Thank you for the clarity.
I think we're required to continue to a date certain. Is that correct?
Yes. All right. Thinking very quickly here. So it doesn't sound like that date is very doable for quorum purposes and full board purposes. It's weird.
We could do it at the regular meeting with a commitment to try and keep it narrowly focused.
No, it's not going to happen.
Well, there is an option to. There is a possibility to.
I wouldn't put in the
Even just to have that date as a check-in for scheduling purposes, to make sure that reports are coming in and any peer review is coming in, and to get that and not have any discussion to continue forward from the regular meeting would be a possibility on the 19th, just to get an update timeline-wise on when we're
That'd
going
be
to
fine, just from the- yeah, but
be
not as a
expecting all of that.
Yeah.
Would you need a quorum at a meeting to make that happen?
Well, we'll be here for a regular meeting.
Yes, but
Oh, at the regular meeting.
at the regular meeting, even to make a quorum, is you still need to have, it would still count as a hearing time. So if Ernie were not available for that regular meeting, then he would be ineligible to continue in the hearing process.
Right.
Outside of general attendance for fun as a member of the public. So that may be an option. We'd be able to,
Is Ian here on the 19th to do that?
that may be the smartest date, and then we'll have exact dates for when we expect the peer review report to be back and consent dates for that to be in, and then comments behind.
Yeah.
You look like you have something to say. Please hop in.
Well, I'm just concerned, you need to continue to a date certain, the hearing.
That's what we're just saying.
Yeah.
Correct.
That's what
So if you wanted to put an agenda discussion check-in item that you don't need a full quorum for, that's fine, and have a date certain for the continued hearing. But I'm just concerned that you pick a date certain for the hearing and then you don't have a member available. Because even if you're just spending 5 minutes when you open that hearing, you're opening the hearing.
No, exactly. I mean, I think the question is everyone here for the hearing on the 19th, the regular meeting?
Yeah.
Yeah.
So, so I think setting it for the 19th and just committing to having a limited discussion, so that we're not here till 10 o'clock, probably works.
I think the discussion that day would just be to go over what dates peer review report will be back and comments are due in, and then we'll set the date for the full
the next
discussion
meeting?
of that.
Of the peer review.
Correct.
So anybody who wants anything reviewed should submit it by the 19th.
It seems to me we had a lot of continuances for the 19th. And it's going to be a busy meeting anyway, so
Yeah.
it's just for dates.
I mean, I think that, I'll be pinning down the date we're expecting that report back tomorrow.
Tomorrow, yeah.
So, again, I don't want to have him rush through the review, especially now that there's some added emphasis on some of the particular sections from tonight's discussion for it. Want to obviously have a time to get it reviewed completely. So I think knowing what that's going to be and setting the date from there at the hearing on the 19th and just having that as, information is due in by this date, peer review report is going to be in this date. We're going to set the hearing for this date and everything needs to be in front of it, and then have kind of the full discussion from there.
So I have a question, Jeff. Do you think that you would have a model order or anything that from the staff that the reviewer would be considering as well?
If the commission instructs it to be so, then that is possible, yes. If they want to review on the information that's currently submitted, then that's what it will be. But we can have, like I said, we can have any piece of information or document that they're requesting of staff ready at any time.
So do they have to request that now, or could they?
I require instructions to take action on behalf of the
You
commission.
should. You're a smart man, Jeff. But my question is, in order for the peer reviewer to review information submitted by the 19th, do you have to be instructed today?
Well, I can submit all of the current information, and I think that's the impression I have. Submit everything that's been submitted to this point, including the information that was submitted as part of tonight's hearing, to the reviewer to complete a review of the application. Anything in addition to what's been submitted as of 6:31 p.m. today would require, if it's from staff level, instructions from the commission, or if it's from other members of the public, they would have to submit it and then get it to the reviewer if it's relevant to the review.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, the reviewer has to take as long as he needs to review it.
Sure.
No, I think the question was whether or not.
And I have another question for town council,
Our request.
which is, I think enough.
Ian, 1 second.
Excuse me.
I think the point of this was that we would have information to instruct Jeff to tell the reviewer what we're looking for. I think what we're looking for here is so we have enough direction for Jeff to tell the reviewer what we're looking for to be reviewed.
Right.
That's all.
as opposed to just reviewing the file.
Right. Or is that what everyone wants? I mean, so it's, I think that's what Jeff is asking for is more of a defined.
Right, so
I'll be sending the reviewer, because that's pretty clear that that's been requested. He'll get all of the information that is part of the record up to this point. And he'll do his job and go through, and I'm sure he'll review all of the information that was submitted and provide comments back on the merits of the project and their compliance to state and local regulations, and then also to the appropriateness of the proposal.
Okay, I think that will make it work.
Okay. Oh, wait, question? Dan, I mean,
Point of information. Could
your
you just
name-
tell
Dan,
us?
could you give your name
sorry,
again?
Deanne Atherton. Could you just tell us how a peer review works?
a third-party reviewer?
A third-party reviewer. So, could you just tell us how that works, please? So, Jeff engages a third-party reviewer who reviews the record and then comes back to you. So all communications between the third-party reviewer are through Jeff, not through the applicant.
That is correct.
Right.
So there will be no communication between the applicant and the third-party reviewer.
No. So the way all of our third-party review works, whether it's this project or we use other reviewers for everything from pond coalition projects to some private residences at times, all third-party reviews are coordinated through staff, and any information that reviewer requests is done through staff as well to make sure that there's no even perception of direct contact from any applicant or property owner to that third-party reviewer. So everything runs through our office. If they have questions, like just for an example, if there's a question about information that Applied Coastal has put forward, that question would come to me. I would send off to them. They would provide that back, and I would put that as part of the record as well. And then to there, if we were asking questions and they wanted questions clarified from the applicant, that question would come to me, because then it all becomes part of the record going forward as well. So our office is the hub of all information, and there's no direct back and forth between any of those groups.
Thank you. We appreciate that clarification.
Yeah. And Jeff, I just want to also clarify that if the public or the applicant wants to have anything reviewed by the applicant, by the third-party reviewer, the proper way to do that is to submit it to you between now and the 19th.
Correct.
Yeah.
So I have a question, Mr. Chairman.
Please, go ahead.
Which is, I think a number of legal issues have been raised. And so will it be appropriate to have an executive session with town council to discuss those?
Not really, because right now you just have a permitting issue in front of you. You're not hearing this in conjunction with a pending lawsuit, so you can't go into executive session for that purpose. It doesn't involve a right or interest in real estate, at least from your perspective, so you wouldn't be able to do that. Select board might be a different story. If they're talking about town-owned land that they want to talk about, they could do that in executive session. Or if SBPF threatened to sue them or something like that, they could discuss that. But for your permitting matter, really, there's no grounds to go into executive session at this point.
Thank you.
I would keep in mind as well, I anticipate that you would be seeking a couple of opinions from town council on this. Typically, the way people can put labels on legal opinions. Typically, when I provide a legal opinion to a permitting board, and the permitting board is expected or does rely on that opinion, either relies on it in accepting it or rejecting it, from my perspective, that becomes a public record. So even though it's coming from your attorney, if you're using it and referencing it or relying on it in part on your permitting decision, I've always treated that as something that then is a public record. So just keep that in mind, that opinions that you're requesting from town council most likely will end up being public records, as opposed to a privileged attorney-client information.
But the commission can ask questions through Jeff of town council at any time.
Yeah, but if I provide a written opinion, it's going to become a public record.
Got you. Very good. Okay.
All right, so
So,
given all that, I think my recommendation would be that you guys continue to the regular hearing on the 19th to get just a scheduling update, not necessarily have a substantive discussion, but a scheduling update to set when the actual hearing, conversation, and discussion will take place from there. And we can work out rooms and things in advance for
19th.
options.
that,
And we'll try to have it as close as possible together to make that work.
that's my request, Mr. Chairman.
Okay, so if there are no more questions, you would like to continue till the 19th?
Yes, sir.
Very good. Okay. Thank you, everyone, for coming. We have some other business, but I appreciate everyone showing up. Thank you.
As we do have other business, if people are going to have conversations and things, if you could please take them out of the room, it would be most helpful.
Yeah.
I apologize for dragging this part in, but I thought we had done it at the meeting last time. But you can take a look past that.
Okay. Everyone head out. We'll get you a big ass crane to lift down there. You never know.
I'm ready.
You never know.
I have lifted a D6 before, but it wasn't open yet.
Yeah,
It was
well,
open large.
I always wonder about that.
All right, so I guess while they're
Shall we go ahead?
going past around is, yeah, if you want to announce it, you can.
Yeah, so this is part of the public meeting here, orders and conditions for Key Bank National Association, 14 Washing Pond Road.
Yes. So I had meant to give this to you at the last regular hearing, and it clears something off of our agenda completely for the 19th. We take a look at it. So 14 Key Bank was the singular Wilkinson array that's in between the other two coastal engineering structures out there. I had instructions for a positive order, but just trying to rid us of some things that are ready to go, because I know the next meeting is going to be no 9 o'clock meeting, but anything I think we can do to lessen that agenda will be helpful.
Would be a nice
So-
holiday present.
So it's the pretty standard order it's the standalone. There's no fencing involved. There's currently nothing there. But it's kind of the new revised order that we've been working on for those projects, and it's fairly consistent with the other ones.
Since this is long and my brain's feeling off, this is the one where they had to remove all that debris that was already existing in front, or was that the other one we saw?
That is the other one.
Okay.
Clarity.
What's that? Sure.
Oh.
Yeah.
So Art Gasparo, for clarity, this is the one that had the dune guard pieces on it.
Oh,
This
so
is
it
the one-
is.
Yeah.
Yes.
It
So I
should be
guess
removed.
Sorry,
Yeah,
and it's the one that has the revetment on the west end
Right.
that's existing.
So I think that you would add a new condition. Consistent condition number 36, that all existing debris on the beach, the coastal beach, shall be removed prior to installation. Actually, I'll put shall be removed prior to or during installation. But these are the orders. We had started adding that requirement that everything be back in repair within 21 days as well. And then it's fairly regular from there.
We're not worried about the legal definition of debris, I take it. Okay.
Well, we also want them to pick up if there's anything else that comes up, if they find a piece of core material or piece of dune guard fencing and not just posts, that any and all debris is removed.
So then should we say anything that's on the coastal beach during or after installation, or if it becomes exposed in case there's things that are buried? Is that implied?
We'll add to that, if any debris uncovers and removed, it shall also be removed.
There's a shipwreck that floats around out there. You might come across that. It's huge.
After providing notice to the commission. That way, if it is Andy's ship that magically appears and they tell us what it is, we may ask them to take extra steps to make sure that they're not going to break anything.
Don't break the shipwreck. It's huge. It's over 50 feet material.
There's a wreck out there.
There's a wreck on that beach. It floats around. I haven't seen it for years, but
I haven't seen it for 15.
I took pictures of it when it was exposed once. It's huge. It's big, big timbers too. But okay. So exactly, I want it in my yard. Okay, so someone can make a motion.
Motion to accept with additional finding number 36.
Second.
All those in favor?
Aye.
Any opposed? That one passes unanimously.
Thank you.
Thank you. You stuck around. Thanks for sticking around.
Sure. Always the last, Art.
Hmm?
Always the last.
Always the last. Yep.
If you want to skip the others, that you can.
Well, I think we approved minutes are great. We didn't get any monitoring reports, enforcements, nothing to hear.
Well, I do have a comment to make.
Please.
Actually, and it's about all the documents that I collected to show that their claims were false. And the Posner property at 77, I don't think any of you saw the actual floor plan that demonstrates how it is on the other side. There you go. How it is absolutely clear that the house has had far more than 20% added to it. And we're being told that it's, basically, we're being told that, you know,
I think in the absence of a house qualifying under the pre-78 or less than 20%, they're saying, well, there's infrastructure then, and there is, so what is it? What are they going for? Infrastructure with the road and or the beach path is what that seems to be falling back on.
All right. So we're moving dangerously back into public hearing path here.
Yeah.
I think the easiest way is I will borrow that from you and scan it all in and put it up for everyone to see and consume, and then we can discuss it when it comes up and not risk open meeting law violations. But I do appreciate the concern.
No, I appreciate that material.
I'm glad Jordan was in the room for that.
You would have been yelling for
So-
You would have been yelling for his seat again. Yeah.
I just have one question or comment. Is the 2019 meeting schedule up?
Yeah, we're gonna send that out tomorrow. We had to make some revisions, but we had talked about, because we're losing the upstairs room, making some shifts to probably moving the meetings to Thursday so we can keep them at 4.
Yeah, I just want to make sure.
And we'll be down
Wait
here.
Wait a second. Meetings, we're talking about meetings on Thursdays?
Yes. We talked about that once before as the group.
That doesn't work for me.
So,
That just doesn't.
so we may have to move it around a little bit, but the other option that we were presented by the town
I'll be phoning in from hockey coaching.
was, the other option that was given to us was trying to move to the water company meeting room. And if anyone's been in the water company meeting room, it might seat 12. So it's just not possible.
Well, isn't that good? Then we can
All
So,
that new building.
that
Get
being
12
said,
seated.
one of the proposals for anyone that wasn't paying attention was that there's a little bit of a push to move our office and the health department out of our current locations and into the old fire station. And Roberto and I have both been pushing for converting like half of that garage into a dedicated meeting space for primarily the Conservation Commission and the Board of Health. And then people can fill in times around it would be available, but there would be somewhere that would hold staff, the board, and then an additional 30 to 40 people. And that's pretty typical. Obviously, for something like Sconset, you can schedule separately into a bigger room if you need it, but it would be actual dedicated meeting space that we'd have kind of first dibs on. So, not saying it's a perfect solution, but it may provide us more flexibility time-wise and date-wise, and not have to play the circus of dodging meetings. Because at the fire station there is parking, and I think part of that proposal would also maybe remove the garage that's there to provide a little bit more. So, again, not a perfect solution, but it may be a better option for us. We're just trying to work with what we can confirm for rooms and spaces, since that upstairs is seemingly going away after the new year here pretty quickly. So we're just trying to make a schedule that works, that we can kind of keep the time. Trust me, the other time that we really had an option for was Friday, and we kind of immediately said, not happening. So we just run into conflicts, and for whatever reason, the way they prioritize the space is, if you've been meeting in the space, you seem to hold more priority than people coming into the space. And Wednesday nights, obviously, the select board takes this room at 6 most Wednesdays, which kind of knocks that out for us most times on Wednesdays for down here. Zoning Board of Appeals meets on Mondays, and they overlap. Health Department is on some days, and we're kind of dodging them. Tuesdays, there's a few that are scheduled in. FinComs have some Tuesdays as well. And we kind of left Tuesdays alone because I don't know where the HDC is going to go. So,
what is the time frame that we need to find a space? Do we know?
Time frame.
We went to 9
Get
a few
room.
weeks ago.
No, I mean a room. Like is it 6 months down the road that they need to? Because the HCC back in the day, not to age myself, but we used to meet in the courtroom.
Oh, no. Well, the Concom met at 37 Washington Street for years, in the high school cafeteria and those things. The high school,
206 and the high school sits 30.
the last time we talked to the high school, they weren't.
Ashley's got keys.
They weren't. Maybe we could just meet in her classroom. We'll just meet there.
30 seats, pack them in.
The high school wasn't taking.
Do we have to correct papers if we go?
The high school wasn't taking spaces when we first asked, because
Desks, I don't think, Joe.
it was before the school year had started, and they prioritized, and understandably so, school activities over outside activities first. I mean, we can re-ask about our normal Wednesday times then, to see if the school would have availability. I also don't want to, if we can avoid it, I don't want to have to pay for meeting space as well, because.
So what is this possible change in?
So
meeting days?
we can
When
try
is this going to
a
affect?
different venue that's not here altogether, and see if the school is available, and try to hold our 4 p.m. Wednesday times, or the day that's really available in this space. And I will tell you, we reserved it under the comment, we may cancel all of these if we find somewhere different, is on Thursdays. So the other advantage to Thursdays from an applicant standpoint is those dates become single advertisements, because you meet the requirement for public advertising. So instead of paying for 2, you'd be paying for 1. Not that really, I don't think an applicant has ever not filed because of the I&M fee, but
Well, I can, sorry to interrupt, Jeff, but I build my whole schedule around this schedule.
Yes.
And I think we probably all do. We're all busy, and, you know, they're building a new fire station, they're kicking us out. Have the town find us another space for Wednesday night.
okay, that's easily done. So we can.
Yeah.
Well, I think his Thursday conflict, I'm like right after him, so I have
So-
kind of the similar conflict.
Trust me, I literally moving for all of us. I know changing schedules from day to day is literally like moving heaven and earth with everything else that's going on. So we only booked this space here because it was open, knowing that we could look at it and see if it just wasn't going to work. We say we'll find another space and we'll go from there. So if that's what we want to do, we'll